The Holocaust was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million European Jews by the Nazi German regime and its allies and collaborators. It began in 1933 when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came into power and ended in 1945 when the Allied powers defeated Nazi Germany, ending World War II. Over the 1930s, the Nazi Party began using the government to target and exclude Jews from German society. Anti-Semitic measures, including discriminatory laws and organized violence, became increasingly radical, culminating in a plan called the Final Solution to the Jewish Question, the mass execution of European Jews across German-controlled Europe. This genocide was implemented between 1941 and 1945. Nazi Germany dehumanized and devalued entire groups of people on the basis of Nazi ideology, which was racist, anti-Semitic, anti-communist, anti-gypsy, pro-eugenics, and ultra-nationalist. While Jews were considered to be Nazis' number one enemy, they also targeted additional groups of people whom they perceived as enemies or threats. The Nazi ideology of the one perfect race led to the genocide of Jews, and widespread persecution, brutalization, and murder of millions of others. As early as the 1920s, a period of strong nativism and the rise of eugenics, the United States put laws into place limiting the amount of refugees able to enter the U.S. In 1935, the Nazi government passed the Nuremberg race laws, which, among other stipulations, revoked German citizenship from Jews. Nazi lawyers studied American laws restricting the rights of black and brown Americans when planning the Reich citizenship law. The persecution of Jews in German-controlled areas was a known occurrence to the American public. American journalists in Germany during the 1930s reported on Nazi policies and plans, like the boycott of Jewish businesses. In the U.S., at least 65 cities held massed protests, anti-Nazi rallies, and marches. The Night of Broken Glass was front-page news in the U.S. for weeks. By 1938, the Jewish refugee crisis had begun. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called an international conference to discuss the crisis. 32 countries met, most of which said their countries were sympathetic but would not admit refugees. The German government claimed it was astounding that these governments criticized Nazi policy but were unwilling to accept Jewish immigrants. When the Jewish refugee debate came to a head, local Huntsville congregations were working to provide as much aid as possible. One example of this is the Goldsmith family, who attempted to extract family members from Germany, even calling in favors from the congressman who would win the bid for Redstone Arsenal's placement in Madison County. The Goldsmiths were congregants of Temple B'nai Shalom, which had a relief committee that raised funds to aid Jews abroad. Between 1933 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its allies established more than 44,000 camps and other incarceration sites, including ghettos. Nazi officials used these sites for a range of purposes, including forced labor, detention of real and perceived enemies of the state, and for mass murder. The first concentration camp, Dachau, opened in March 1933, outside of Munich, Germany. It was the longest-running camp in operation, liberated in April of 1945. Not all facilities were concentration camps, though they are often referred to in this way. Initially, over 30,000 German Jews were incarcerated in Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen concentration camps in Germany, until each could provide proof of their ability to emigrate. However, with most nations refusing to harbor refugees and German laws becoming more restrictive, the likelihood of their release quickly diminished. Of the millions incarcerated, only a small fraction survived the camps. As Allied troops moved across Europe against Nazi Germany in 1944 and 1945, they encountered concentration camps, mass graves, and other sites of Nazi crimes. The unspeakable conditions the liberators confronted shed light on the full scope of Nazi horrors. After the Soviet capture of Majdanek, Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler ordered that all prisoners in all camps in the German-occupied East be evacuated into the interior of the Reich. Thus, as Allied troops launched offensives within Germany, they encountered tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners. Most of these prisoners were suffering from starvation and disease and resembled little more than skeletons. Several Huntsville citizens were involved in the liberation of concentration camps. Members of the 104th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Timberwolf, overran Nordhausen and the Dora Mittelbau camp on April 11, 1945. They discovered 3,000 corpses and some 750 emaciated, starving, and ill prisoners left behind when the SS evacuated the inmates on death marches. Prisoners were forced to construct massive tunnels and work in underground factories, producing V-2 rockets for the German military. The Nazis effectively used propaganda to win the support of millions of Germans to facilitate persecution, war, and ultimately genocide. The stereotypes and images found in Nazi propaganda were not new, but were already familiar to their intended audience. It played an integral role in advancing the persecution and ultimately the destruction of Europe's Jews, inciting hatred and fostering a climate of indifference to their fate. The Nazi Party led boycotts of Jewish businesses with the intent to drive Jews from the German economy. Legal curtailment of Jewish businesses also made it extremely difficult to operate businesses. These government-driven and condoned curtailments led to mass vandalism, poverty, loss of property, and displacement to tiny, ill-equipped, and underfunded Jewish ghettos. This culminated in the Kristallnacht attacks, or Night of Broken Glass, resulting in the arrest of 30,000 Jewish men and boys, destruction of hundreds of synagogues and businesses, and the government fining Jewish victims 1 billion Reichsmarks for damage. Nazi Germany required Jews and other enemies of the state to wear badges as public identifiers. The government revoked Jews' German citizenship and expelled thousands from the country. Many nations refused entry of refugees, leading to an international crisis and stasis in no man's land, areas between countries where no government wanted to aid the systematically impoverished refugees. The relatively few refugees who were able to obtain identification papers and fees for passage on ships were at mercy of foreign nations to accept them. Jews who were unable to escape were eventually loaded into cattle trains with no rations and in unsanitary conditions, to be mass transported to Nazi camps where they were separated from their families and branded with identification numbers on their arms. Experiences in Nazi camps varied, but had several overarching similarities, like mass starvation and malnutrition, widespread untreated disease endemics, overcrowding, and would intentionally be under-equipped. Labor camps would, quite literally, work prisoners to death. Some camps included medical facilities, where German physicians conducted painful and often deadly experiments on thousands of prisoners without their permission. These experiments centered on the survival of military personnel, testing of drugs and treatments, and the advancement of Nazi racial and ideological goals. Mass murders began at Chelmno, the first stationary killing center that used poison gas, on December 8, 1941. At least 172,000 prisoners were killed there. The following month, Nazi officials met at the Wannsee Conference to discuss, coordinate, and enact the final solution, resulting in the execution of millions via gas chambers, firing lines, and death marches. For survivors, returning to life as normal was impossible. Jewish communities no longer existed in much of Europe. Those who were able to return to their homes often found that their houses had been looted or taken over by others. Many Jews ended up in displaced persons camps in Western Europe under Allied military occupation at the sites of former concentration camps, waiting to be admitted to other countries like the US, South Africa, or Palestine. In 1947, the United Nations voted to divide Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, forming the State of Israel in 1948, and beginning the modern conflict that is still ongoing today. Although many Jewish survivors were able to build new lives in adopted countries, many non-Jewish victims of Nazi policies continued to be persecuted in Germany. Laws which discriminated against Roma continued to be in effect until 1970 in some parts of the country, and the laws used to imprison LGBTQ individuals remained in effect until 1969. Huntsville's history with the Holocaust is complicated by its post-war economic boom, thanks to the work of German and known former Nazi expatriate rocketeers. Their work during World War II, utilizing brutal labor camps, gave rise to the V-2, one of the most devastating rocket-powered missiles used against military and civilian targets up to that point. Their work in Huntsville placed the U.S. in competitive standing during the space race and Cold War. The post-WW2 heightened sense of patriotism and competition precluded discussion about where the scientists came from, even though their origins were known and former work was presumed. There are several institutions worldwide that are dedicated to Holocaust research and commemoration. US HMM teaches that the Holocaust was preventable and that by heeding warning signs and taking early action, individuals and governments can save lives. With this knowledge, the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, a branch of US HMM, works to do for the victims of genocide today what the world failed to do for the Jews of Europe in the 1930s and 1940s.